Welcome to a story told in the quiet hours. A tale that drifts on the sea salt air, carried by the mournful cries of gulls and the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water against a forgotten shore. It is a story steeped in a profound and ancient sorrow, a secret so heavy it has sunk to the bottom of the world, resting among the rusted anchors and the bleached white shells of long-dead things. Tonight, we will venture far from the gothic spires of Ihanam, past the waking nightmares and the clamor of the hunt, to a place shrouded in perpetual mist and a more profound, more personal tragedy. We will listen to the whispers on the wind, to the curses spat from malformed mouths, and piece together the hidden truth of the Fishing Hamlet. This is a story of a sin that stained the very cosmos, a story to carry you into the depths of dream, so settle in, close your eyes, and listen. Imagine, if you will, a coastline that does not exist on any map you have ever seen, a place where the sky and the sea bleed into one another in a seamless, silver-gray expanse. This is how it was before the fall. The air here was thick, not with the coming rain, but with a permanent, gentle mist, a breath of the ocean that settled on the skin like a cool, damp cloth and left the taste of salt on the lips. The village itself was a ramshackle collection of wooden huts and jetties, built not against the sea, but with it, as if the timbers had grown from the waterlogged earth, twisted by the wind and the salt into organic, living shapes. Nets, heavy with the scent of brine and decay, hung from every eave, mending themselves slowly in the patient hands of the fisherfolk. Their faces were weathered, carved by the elements into masks of serene acceptance, their eyes holding the deep, placid darkness of the ocean depths. Their lives were dictated by the tides, by the shifting of unseen currents and the silent, colossal movements in the abyssal plains far below. They did not merely fish these waters, they communed with them. Their existence was a slow, rhythmic dance with the sea, a symbiotic relationship built on a foundation of reverence and a quiet, unspoken understanding. They knew the sea was not empty. They knew it was a vast, breathing entity, a cathedral of crushing pressure and bioluminescent light, home to things that defied the very concept of form. Great leviathans, beings of immense scale and ancient thought, moved through the blackness, and the villagers did not fear them. They saw them as guardians, as manifestations of the sea's soul, and they listened for the low, resonant frequencies of their calls, a hum that vibrated through the hulls of their boats and up through the very planks of their homes. This was their spirituality, a faith not written in books or preached from pulpits, but felt in the pull of a line, heard in the crash of a wave, seen in the phosphorescent bloom that sometimes lit the midnight swells. And at the heart of this faith was a name, whispered not in prayer, but in gratitude, a name that was both a sound and a sensation, Kos. Or, as some of the more contemplative elders would murmur, gazing at the star-strewn sky reflected in the still water, Kosm. It was not a god to be appeased, but a presence to be acknowledged, a benevolent intelligence from the cosmos that had chosen this remote, misty shore, this specific point of reality, to rest, to watch, and perhaps to nurture. The villagers were its keepers, its witnesses, and in return, the sea provided, the great beings offered a passive, cosmic patronage. And life, though simple and often harsh, was in a state of perfect, fragile balance. Far from this salt-scrubbed peace, in the hallowed, ivy-choked halls of Byrgenwerth, a different kind of hunger was growing. It began, as such things often do, with a noble, burning curiosity. Provost Willem, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of ancient texts and radical thought, had founded the college as a sanctuary for true enlightenment, a place to push beyond the veils of mundane perception. He sought insight, a word that on his lips meant more than knowledge. It meant sight beyond sight, a perception of the underlying architecture of the universe, the hidden gears and pulleys that moved reality itself. His motto, spoken to his most promising pupils, was a simple yet profound command: fear the old blood. It was a warning against a path he saw as base, corporeal, a distraction of the flesh. He sought a purer ascent, an evolution of the mind. The initial discovery in the labyrinthine tombs beneath Ihanam was a revelation that shattered their understanding of the world. They found the remnants of the Pithumerians, a civilization that had communed with the Great Ones, and they found the holy medium, the cold, phantasmal fluid known as the old blood. But more terrifying and alluring than the blood were the kin, the celestial children of the Great Ones, beings of pure insight, their forms a blasphemy against nature, their minds a window into the cosmos. Willem's initial caution began to curdle, not into fear, but into a desperate, ravenous ambition. The pursuit of insight became an obsession. The scholars, these men and women of reason and logic, began to gaze into the abyss, and the abyss, as it is wont to do, gazed back. They hungered for the eyes that would line their brains, to see what the kin could see, to know what the Great Ones knew. This was no longer a scholarly pursuit, it was a fever. Whispers began to circulate, tales of a remote coastal village where the line between the human and the cosmic was not just blurred, but non-existent, where a living Great One was said to slumber, and where its influence had created things. Unwanted offspring. For the scholars of Byrgenwerth, this was not a tragedy or a mystery to be understood. It was a resource to be harvested. The quiet, symbiotic faith of the fisherfolk was about to be met with the violent, acquisitive hunger of a new kind of predator. And so they came, not as scholars, but as hunters. Led by Jaeman, the first of his kind, a man whose practical genius with weaponry was matched only by a deep, unspoken melancholy, they descended upon the hamlet. With him was his most gifted pupil, a woman of noble bearing and fierce grace named Maria. One can only imagine the dissonance they must have felt, stepping from the ordered, intellectual world of Byrgenwerth into this primal, mist-drenched landscape. The air, which to the villagers was life-giving, to them would have been cloying, oppressive. The rhythmic sounds of the sea, a lullaby to the inhabitants, would have been a chaotic, unsettling noise. They came with their trick weapons, their firearms, their purpose steeled by the certainty of their own enlightenment, The confrontation was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The fisherfolk, armed with harpoons and fish-cleaving blades, were defenders of their home, but they were not soldiers. They were no match for the surgical, brutal efficiency of Jayaman's hunters. The peaceful shore ran red, the salt air now thick with the iron scent of blood. The cries of the gulls drowned out by the screams of the dying and the cold, clinical reports of pistols. But the true horror, the sin that would echo through eternity, was what they came for. They moved through the carnage, their eyes not on the human dead, but searching for the anomalies, the results of Kos's proximity. They sought the celestial children, the unwanted offspring, the half-human, half-kin hybrids that were the villagers' shame and secret. These were harvested with a chilling, clinical detachment, plucked from their hiding places, from the arms of their wailing mothers, to be taken back to Byrgenwerth for experimentation, for the precious fluid that coursed through their bizarre veins. And then they found the source. They found the body of Kos herself, washed upon the shore, a colossal, beautiful, and terrifying form, a being from the stars now beached and lifeless on this lonely coast. The exact nature of her death remains one of the story's great mysteries, whether she was already dead when she washed ashore, or whether the hunters delivered the final, blasphemous blow. But what is known, what is seared into the very fabric of the nightmare that was born that day, is that they desecrated her. They violated the sacred body of a benevolent great one, cutting it open, searching its womb for secrets, for more of the precious kin they so coveted. In that moment, on that blood-soaked shore, they did not merely commit murder, they committed a cosmic transgression. They broke a covenant between humanity and the gods, and the silence that followed was not peace, but the held breath of the universe before its terrible, grieving wrath. That wrath did not come as a thunderbolt from a clear sky, but as a creeping, inescapable tide. From the violated womb of the dead mother, a presence emerged, a spectral, wailing thing, the Orphan of Kos. It was a being of pure, undiluted anguish, a child born not of life, but of a profound and violent death. Its first cry was not a sound, but a wave, a distortion that rippled out from the hamlet, not through space, but through the very substance of dream and nightmare. The sin upon the shore was so great, so antithetical to the natural order, that it created its own reality, a pocket dimension of perpetual punishment. This was the hunter's nightmare, a realm born from the orphan's grief and the collective guilt of its perpetrators. It was not a simple hell. It was a recursive, inescapable loop, a memory of the massacre played out for eternity, designed to trap not only Jayaman and his hunters, but all who would come after them, all who would succumb to the blood drunkenness that was the legacy of their violence. The hamlet itself was transformed, frozen in its moment of ultimate despair. The mist became a permanent, choking shroud. The once life-giving sea became a toxic, sickly green, its waves now carrying the bloated, mutated forms of the villagers, their humanity stripped away, replaced by the features of deep-sea horrors, their mouths forever forming silent curses. The very air grew heavy with the weight of the curse, a palpable miasma of regret and fury. This was the consequence. This was the price of the insight they had so recklessly sought. They had reached for the cosmos, and the cosmos had reached back, not with enlightenment, but with a mirror, forcing them to gaze upon the monstrous reflection of their own ambition for all time. The fishing hamlet was no longer a place. It was a monument to a sin, a wound in the world that would not heal, and its mournful, salt-laden wind would now blow through the dreams of every hunter, a constant reminder of the atrocity that birthed their twisted lineage. The transformation of the hamlet was not instantaneous, but a slow, dreadful seepage, as if the landscape itself were bleeding from a wound that would never close. The wooden huts, once silvered by sea spray and sun, now seemed to sag under an invisible weight, their timbers groaning with a new, internal misery. The nets hanging from the eaves were no longer being mended. They rotted where they swung, becoming shrouds for the memory of a life that was, their fibers unraveling like the frayed edges of a forgotten promise. The salt in the air, once clean and invigorating, now carried a new, foul undertone, the cloying sweetness of decay mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of old blood, a scent that clung to the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed. The very light changed, the silver gray of the mist giving way to a sickly, jaundiced yellow, a perpetual twilight that seemed to emanate from the corrupted sea itself, casting long, distorted shadows that moved with a life of their own. The villagers who had been slaughtered did not find peace in death. Their spirits, tethered to the site of their massacre by the sheer, violent intensity of their final moments, were woven into the fabric of the nightmare. They became phantoms, echoes of their former selves, doomed to reenact the last, terrified moments of their lives. One could see them sometimes, translucent figures hauling on ghostly nets, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their mouths open in silent, perpetual screams that were absorbed by the thick, muffling air. Their anguish was a low, constant hum, a vibration felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears, the psychic residue of a community extinguished. And for those who had been touched by Kos's grace, the transformation was far more grotesque. Their bodies, already hinting at a heritage not entirely of this earth, bloated and twisted in the cursed waters. Their skin took on the slick, rubbery texture of deep-sea dwellers, peppered with parasitic barnacles that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. Their limbs elongated, becoming boneless, grasping tentacles, while their faces distended, jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, their human eyes clouding over with the milky blindness of creatures from the abyssal plain. They became the fish priests and the shark giants, monstrous custodians of this sunken cathedral of sorrow, their once reverent prayers to the sea now twisted into guttural, hate-filled bellows. They patrolled the flooded lanes and the crumbling jetties, their every movement a testament to a sacred bond profaned, their existence a weapon of vengeance aimed at any hunter foolish enough to stumble into their domain. High above, in the clock tower that served as the nexus of this nightmare, The architects of this hell were ensnared in their own uniquely tailored torments. Jaemin, the first hunter, was trapped in a cruel parody of his old workshop. It was a place of memory and longing, filled with the scent of sawdust and the familiar, comforting weight of his tools, yet it was also his prison. He was bound to the dream, a perpetual caretaker for a cycle of violence he could no longer control. One could hear him, in the quiet moments between the screams of other hunters, weeping in his sleep, his old body racked with sobs for a freedom he would never again grasp. His pupil, the proud and formidable Lady Maria, was given a punishment that cut far deeper than any physical cage. Disgusted by the atrocities she had witnessed and participated in at the hamlet, she had cast her beloved Rakuyo into a dark well, a symbolic rejection of her hunter's life. Yet in the nightmare, she was forced to guard the very secret she so despised, stationed at the entrance to the astral clock tower, the gateway to the hamlet below. She was the eternal warden of the memory she wished to forget, her refined combat style now a dance of elegant self-flagellation, her every parry and thrust a reminder of the blood that would never wash from her hands. Her existence was a paradox, a guardian protecting a truth she found abhorrent, her immortality a sentence to forever contemplate the moment her pursuit of insight curdled into monstrous sin. And at the heart of it all, on the very shore where the transgression occurred, the Orphan of Kos endured its own singular agony. It was never truly alive, this spectral child. It was a manifestation, a thought given form, the concentrated essence of a mother's death scream and a child's stolen future. It did not play or learn or grow. It only existed in a state of raw, inconsolable fury. Its form was a pitiful thing, a pale, wizened homunculus, clutching the massive, weathered placenta that was its only connection to the mother it never knew, a grotesque umbilical cord that served as both blanket and weapon. Its cries were not the simple wails of an infant, but the shrieking of a storm, the grinding of continental plates, a sound that contained the entirety of the tragedy. It would wander the bleak coastline, a lonely, furious godling in a world of its own making. Its grief so potent it physically shaped the nightmare, causing the very stones to weep a black, viscous fluid, and the sky to crackle with phantom lightning. To confront the orphan was not to fight a beast. It was to stand against the concept of sorrow itself, to face the undeniable, screaming truth of the sin that had created this entire, self-contained hell. Its defeat was not a victory, but a form of release, a momentary silencing of a cry that had echoed for an eternity, a brief, fragile pause in the endless, rhythmic punishment of the waves upon the cursed shore. This nightmare, this pocket of damned time, did not exist in isolation. It was a festering cyst on the body of the waking world, and its poison seeped outwards. It became the source of the blood drunkenness that would plague generations of hunters to come. The euphoric, violent frenzy that overtook them was not merely a side effect of the old blood. It was a psychic resonance, an echo of the addictive, reckless hunger that had driven Jaemon's band to the hamlet. Every hunter who lost themselves to the thrill of the hunt was, on some subconscious level, reenacting that original, foundational violence. They were drawn into the nightmare not by chance, but by a karmic gravity, their own accumulated sin and bloodlust, creating a tether that pulled them into the hell forged for their predecessors. They would find themselves on the same blood-soaked streets of Ihanam, but twisted, darker, populated by older, more bestial horrors, and they would hunt until they too were consumed, their consciousnesses dragged down into the nightmare's depths to be torn apart by the very creatures their forebears had created. It was a self-perpetuating engine of suffering, a cycle of violence and punishment from which there seemed no escape, a lesson written in blood and grief that nobody left alive could truly read. The sea, once a source of life and mystery, was now a grave. The great leviathans that had once moved in the silent depths were gone, or perhaps they had simply turned their colossal faces away, abandoning this corrupted stretch of coast to its fate. The water itself seemed to be in pain, its waves crashing against the shore with a weary, reluctant rhythm, as if each touch of the land was an agony. Sometimes, on nights when the nightmare felt particularly thick, one could see strange, luminous shapes swirling in the toxic green depths, not the gentle bioluminescence of healthy sea life, but the frantic, fever-bright patterns of dying things, the lost, flickering embers of a world that had been drowned in sin. The shore was littered with the detritus of the massacre and the curse. Shattered fishing boats whose splintered wood looked like broken bone, rusted anchors that seemed to be clawing their way out of the sand, and the ever-present, bleached white shells that now looked less like natural objects and more like the scattered teeth of some impossibly vast, deceased creature. The wind, the eternal, keening wind, carried the voices of the past, a chorus of lamentation that told the same story over and over, a story with no beginning and no end, only an endless, miserable present. It was a place where time had curled in on itself, a snake eating its own tail, and the only thing that grew here was regret, thick and thorny and inescapable, winding through the ruins of the huts and the souls of the damned alike. And yet, within this ossified eternity, small, almost imperceptible movements hinted at a deeper, more complex suffering. The curse was not a static painting of despair, but a living, breathing entity that digested its inhabitants slowly. The black, viscous fluid that wept from the stones did not simply pool and stagnate. It sometimes gathered into trembling, iridescent globules that quivered with a nervous energy before sliding, with a sound like a sigh, back into the cracks from which they came. These were the nightmare's tears, the physical manifestation of a grief so vast it had to be periodically purged, lest the pressure of it shatter the delicate, terrible balance of this pocket dimension. If one were to stand perfectly still on the shore, feeling the gritty, damp sand shift uneasily beneath their feet, they might notice that the sand itself was not composed of mere silica and crushed shell. Closer inspection would reveal minuscule, polished fragments of bone, flecks of tarnished metal from long-lost hunters' buttons, and even what looked like fossilized droplets of blood, all ground together by the relentless, sorrowful motion of the waves into a Kos memorial powder. The sounds, too, were a layered tapestry of anguish. Beneath the constant, low moan of the wind and the occasional, distant bellow of a shark giant, there were subtler frequencies. The creaking of the rotting jetties was not random. It formed a slow, discordant melody, a funeral dirge played on warped wood and rusted nails. The lapping of the sickly green water against the pylons created a rhythmic percussion, a heartbeat that was faltering, diseased. And if one listened with more than their ears, with the inner ear of the soul that hears the echoes of profound events, they might discern the whispers. These were not the clear, articulate curses of the fishmen, but the ghostly remnants of final thoughts, of prayers cut short, of a child's name called out into the sudden darkness. They were like fragments of glass scattered on the air, each one sharp and carrying a sliver of a life. The memory of the sun's warmth on a face, the smell of a stew cooking over a driftwood fire, the simple, profound joy of a full net hauled onto the deck. These whispers were the most cruel part of the nightmare, for they were not expressions of the current misery, but poignant, beautiful memories that served only to highlight the absolute totality of what had been lost. They were the inventory of a paradise recited by ghosts in a hell of their own making. The few structures that still offered a semblance of shelter were themselves steeped in a palpable, cloying sadness. To step inside one of the leaning, dilapidated huts was to be enveloped in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the shoulders. The air within was cold and still, untouched by the keening wind outside, and it smelled of old, wet wood and the profound, musty odor of abandonment. A table might still be set with wooden bowls, now filled not with food, but with a black, brackish water that swirled with motes of phosphorescent algae. A child's toy, a crudely carved wooden fish, might lie half under a collapsed bunk, a tiny monument to a future that was stolen. In the corners, thick, glistening webs were spun not by spiders, but by some unknown nightmare fauna, their strands catching the jaundiced light and glinting like wet, black silk. These huts were not homes anymore. They were tombs for the ordinary, shrines to a domesticity that had been violently erased, and their stillness was more terrifying than the chaos outside, for it spoke of an ending so complete it had even silenced the echoes of life within. The hunters who were drawn into this place, these blood-drunk interlopers, experienced the hamlet not as a historical site, but as a visceral, psychological assault. The very ground seemed to reject their footsteps, the sand pulling at their boots with a sucking grip that felt like accusation. The mist, which obscured vision at every turn, was not merely an environmental hazard. It was a psychic fog, carrying with it fleeting, half-formed images of the massacre. A glint of a hunter's blade, a spray of arterial blood against the gray sky, the wide, terrified eyes of a fisherfolk elder. These visions would flash at the edge of perception, gone before they could be fully comprehended, leaving behind only a residue of dread and a pounding heart. For a hunter still clinging to some shred of their humanity, the hamlet was a gauntlet of guilt. Every mutated villager they were forced to cut down was a reminder of the original sin. The way their harpoons were thrown not with skill, but with a blind, grieving rage, turned each combat into a punishment. The hunter, in defending themselves, became the very monster the nightmare was designed to torture, perpetuating the cycle with every swing of their own cursed weapon. Their blood echoes, the very substance of their power, felt tainted here, humming with a strange, sorrowful frequency that was alien to the echoes gathered in the waking world. And above it all, the sky of the nightmare was a dome of solidified grief. There were no stars, no moon, no suggestion of a cosmos beyond this single, terrible event. Instead, the firmament was a swirling, bruised palette of deep purples, sickly greens, and the dull orange of a perpetual, unseen sunset. Sometimes vast, shadowy forms would drift past behind the veil of cloud, not leviathans, but the shapeless, colossal thoughts of the orphan, its pain given scale and form. The clouds themselves would occasionally part, not to reveal a heavenly body, but to show a vast, pulsating organ, a great heart of the nightmare that beat with a slow, labored, and mournful rhythm, its valves opening and closing with a sound like a distant, groaning ship. This was the true sky of the Fishing Hamlet, not a ceiling of air and space, but the underside of a colossal, suffering consciousness, pressing down on everything below, a constant, oppressive reminder that this entire world was the inside of a wound, and they were all trapped within its infected, feverish flesh. The well where Lady Maria had cast her rakuyo was a site of particular significance, a nexus of the self-loathing that festered at the heart of the tragedy. It was not a simple hole in the ground, but a deep, cylindrical shaft that plunged down through the rock and into the very foundations of the nightmare. The water at its bottom was not water at all, but a black, reflective obsidian liquid, so still, and so dark it seemed to be a portal into an even deeper, more absolute nothingness. To gaze into it was to see no reflection, but to feel one's own sins rise to the surface of the mind, all the petty cruelties and violent impulses given weight and substance. It was said that the rakuyo did not simply lie at the bottom, but was suspended in that black medium, its elegant, twin blades slowly being dissolved not by rust, but by the concentrated essence of regret. The well was a silent, vertical grave for a hunter's pride, and the two monstrous shark giants that endlessly patrolled the flooded cavern around it were not merely gods. They were the incarnate fury of the hamlet, given the specific task of ensuring that this symbol of renunciation, this single act of penitence, would never be retrieved, that the weapon and the shame it represented would remain buried in the darkness forever. This was the enduring truth of the Fishing Hamlet. It was not merely a place of punishment, but a living, breathing reliquary of a lost world. Every drop of acidic water, every groaning timber, every whispered memory was a sacred object in this antechapel, each one holding a fragment of the story. The curse was not just a sentence passed on the guilty. It was the only way the story could continue to be told. In the waking world, history is written by the victors, sanitized and edited to suit the narrative of those who remain. But here, in this nightmare, the victims held the pen. Their pain was the ink, their transformed bodies were the text, and the endless, recursive loop of their suffering was the only means of ensuring that the truth of what happened on that shore could never be forgotten. The horror was the monument, and every hunter who stumbled into this domain became an unwilling pilgrim, forced to walk its sorrowful paths and read its terrible liturgy, written in blood in mutation, and in the silent, screaming face of a motherless child. The slow, rhythmic crunch of sand underfoot was a sound that seemed to absorb all others, a dry, grinding whisper that was the baseline of this silent world. It was not the soft, giving sand of a holiday beach, but a substance more akin to crushed glass and bone, each grain a tiny, hard-edged monument to what had been pulverized here. With every step, a hunter would feel it shift, not with the loose generosity of earth, but with a reluctant, gritty resistance, as if the very ground was unwilling to bear their weight, to be complicit in their passage through this sacred sepulchre. The sound it made was a constant, low-level abrasion, a physical scratching that seemed to grate not just against the soles of their boots, but against the raw edges of their own sanity. It was the sound of memory being ground into dust, of countless moments of simple, sun-warmed life being crushed under the relentless, unforgiving wheel of this eternal present. The waterline was a borderland of profound unease. Here, the toxic green sea met the memorial sand in a froth of sickly, phosphorescent foam. This was no clean, white surf, but a bubbling, oily scum that clung to the shore in long, ragged tendrils, like the spittle of a feverish giant. Each wave that rolled in was sluggish, heavy with its own polluted substance, and when it receded, it left behind not a clean, damp darkening of the sand, but a glistening, iridescent film, a kaleidoscope of foul colors, sickly purples, venomous greens, the deep bruise blue of rotting flesh. This film would shimmer for a moment, catching the jaundiced light in a brief, beautiful, and utterly nauseating display, before seeming to be absorbed back into the grit, leaving behind only a darker, damp patch that smelled of iodine, copper, and a profound, cellular decay. To stand at this margin was to stand at the edge of the world's open wound, to watch it seep and weep its corrupted fluids onto the land, a perpetual, slow-motion contamination of the very concept of Shaw. Within the drowned sections of the village, where the jetties had collapsed, and the huts were slowly being consumed by the stagnant brine, the water was a different kind of entity altogether. It was not the dynamic, if sickly, sea of the shoreline, but a thick, syrupy bog, its surface a taut, greasy skin that barely rippled. It was the color of old moss and gangrene, and it moved with a viscous, reluctant languor, as if it were half-solidified sorrow. To wade through it was a trial of both body and spirit. It pulled at the legs with a cold, cloying suction, each step a battle against a medium that seemed actively hostile to progress. The temperature was unnerving, not the uniform cold of a deep lake, but a patchwork of sensations. One moment, the water would be bitingly frigid, a cold that seeped through leather and wool to ache in the very marrow of the bone. The next, the hunter's boot would sink into a pocket of inexplicable, feverish warmth. A sudden, unsettling flush, as if they had stepped into the still-living blood of a long-dead leviathan. And rising from this bog were the bubbles, not of air, but of some other, more foul gas. They would bulge up from the depths, large and wobbling, traveling with a slow, fat grace to the surface where they would pop with a soft, wet sound, releasing a puff of vapor that carried the concentrated scent of an opened, centuries-old grave. This was the breath of the drowned village, the final, gaseous sighs of the homes, and the people trapped within the mud, still being exhaled long after the lungs that produced them had turned to silt. The few living, or more accurately, persisting, inhabitants who were not yet fully transformed into the hulking fishmen existed in a state of suspended, twitching agony. They could be seen huddled in the less flooded corners of crumbling huts or perched on the skeletal remains of fishing boats, their bodies caught in the middle of the metamorphosis. Their skin was patchy, some areas still retaining the leathery, sun-weathered texture of a human fisherman, while adjacent patches had taken on the slick, scaleless sheen of a deep-sea eel, glistening with a perpetual, unhealthy sweat. Their fingers were often webbed with a thin, translucent membrane, and they would flex them constantly, a nervous, spasmodic gesture as they stared at their own changing hands with a look of confused horror. Their mouths worked soundlessly or emitted low, wet gurgles, as if they were trying to form human words, but their vocal cords had already been reshaped for a different, harsher language. They were the visible record of the curse's progress, living manuscripts on which the text of their own damnation was still being written. They did not attack on sight, but cowered their eyes, one still human and pleading, the other clouding over with the milky film of the abyss, holding a depth of understanding and terror that was far more unsettling than the mindless rage of their fully transformed brethren. To meet their gaze was to be accused not of violence, but of being the author of this impossible biological tragedy. The sounds that emanated from the bellies of the shark giants were a geology of noise. When they bellowed, it was not a sound that began in a larynx, but one that seemed to be born in the cavernous, echoing depths of their digestive tracts. A grinding, rumbling roar that started as a subaudible vibration felt in the pit of the stomach before erupting into a physical force that shook the air. It was the sound of a mountain collapsing underwater, of continents grinding together, a noise so immense and primeval it bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the most ancient reptilian part of the brain, triggering a pure, undiluted flight response. The smaller fishmen, by contrast, produced a cacophony of wet, slapping sounds and high-pitched, chittering shrieks. The sound of their harpoons being dragged across the stone was a nails-on-slate screech that set the teeth on edge, while their footsteps were a series of irregular, sticky plops, as if their feet were not fully solid. The aggregate of these noises, the deep roars, the shrill shrieks, the grinding, the plopping, the ceaseless wind, and the dirge-like creaking of the wood, formed a symphony of madness, a composition without melody or rhythm, whose only purpose was to dismantle, note by terrible note, the listener's grasp on a coherent reality. Time in the hamlet was not a river but a whirlpool. It did not flow in one direction. It circled, eddied, and occasionally seemed to fold back upon itself. A hunter could be walking along a jetty and catch, from the corner of their eye, a flicker of the past, the jetty whole and sturdy, a fisherman in a simple tunic mending a net, the sun a clean, white gold in a clear sky. The vision would be hyperreal, saturated with a color and vitality that was utterly absent from the present nightmare. But it would last only for the space of a single, indrawn breath before collapsing back into the rot and the jaundiced twilight. These temporal stutters were the nightmare's most cruel trick. They were not mere memories, but brief, vivid restorations of the world as it was, offered up like a sip of fresh water to a man dying of thirst, only to be snatched away, leaving the desolation that followed feeling 10 times more absolute. They were glimpses of the stolen life, reinforcing the magnitude of the crime not through description, but through a fleeting, heartbreaking experience of its opposite. They were the ghost of a ghost, a haunting by the memory of peace itself. The spiritual weight of the place was a tangible pressure, a density in the air that had nothing to do with the mist. It was the accumulated grief of 100 souls, compounded over an eternity, and it pressed down on the consciousness like a leaden blanket. For a hunter with even a modicum of insight, this weight manifested as a psychic drone, a monotonous, soul-crushing tone that vibrated at the very core of their being. It was the sound of hopelessness given frequency. It made thought difficult, turning introspection into a trudging through mental quicksand. Every doubt, every regret, every secret shame a hunter carried was amplified, fed, and given voice by this ambient misery. It encouraged a profound lassitude, a desire to simply lie down in the gritty sand and let the sorrow seep in, to become just another static feature of the landscape, another monument to the pointlessness of struggle. This was the true danger of the hamlet, far greater than any harpoon or monstrous fist. Its ability to convince you that its despair was the only rational state of being, that its eternal, recursive punishment was the fundamental truth of existence, and that all hope was a childish delusion that had no place in the crushing, honest reality of this cursed Shaw. And through it all, the presence of the Orphan was the central, gravitational force. One did not need to see it to feel it. Its anguish was the engine of the nightmare, the source from which all this twisted reality flowed. Its crying was not always audible as a sound. Sometimes it was a sudden, sharp pain behind the eyes, a wave of nausea, or a fleeting, inexplicable image of a lonely, star-filled womb. Its influence waxed and waned in cycles, and when its grief was at its peak, the very fabric of the hamlet would grow more unstable. The ground would tremble more violently. The whispers from the past would become more frantic and layered, and the mutations of the fishmen seemed to become more pronounced, their forms writhing with a fresh, agonized energy. To approach the shore where it wandered was to walk into the heart of this emotional storm. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, saturated with the ozone scent of pure, cosmic pain. The very light seemed to dim, as if out of respect for the magnitude of the suffering at its source. And there, on the stained sand, amidst the wreckage of a world, the hunter would find it, not a monster to be slain, but a consequence to be faced. The screaming, wailing, physical proof of a sin so great it had required the creation of an entire new hell to contain its echo. The placenta it dragged behind it was not merely an afterbirth, but a shroud, a burial cloth still sodden with the fluids of a death that was also a genesis. This organic mass was a landscape in itself, a leathery, veined expanse the color of a day-old bruise, mottled with darker patches where the blood had pooled and congealed in its coarse, fibrous weave. It was impossibly large, a weight that should have crushed the tiny, pallid form, yet the Orphan moved it with a terrible, jerking strength. Its thin, bone-white arms clutching the tough, umbilical cord as a lifeline to a mother who was now only a memory and a corpse. The sound it made as it was hauled across the sand and stone was a wet, grinding slough, a noise of immense friction, as if the very earth resisted this desecrated relic's passage. With every drag, it left a glistening, dark trail, not of blood, but of a thicker, more metaphysical substance, a ichor of pure nightmare that smoked faintly upon the cursed ground, seeding the soil with fresh despair. The sky above this final, intimate stage of the tragedy seemed to press lower, the swirling, bruised clouds coalescing into a vortex directly overhead. A slow, deliberate spiral that focused all the ambient misery of the hamlet down upon this single, lonely stretch of shore. The light that filtered through was now a deep, bloody crimson, casting long, distorted shadows that did not follow the laws of the sun, but twitched and writhed independently, as if they were the shades of other, potential tragedies that had branched off from this central, catastrophic event. The air grew so thick with the Orphan's grief that it was difficult to draw a full breath. Each inhalation was a shallow, unsatisfying sip of anguish, tasting of salt, iron, and the electric tang of a reality on the verge of tearing. The wind died away to an absolute stillness, the silence that remained somehow more deafening than the previous cacophony, a held breath in the throat of the world, waiting for the inevitable, final scream. To engage the Orphan was to enter a dance with a concept, not a creature. Its movements were not those of a beast driven by instinct, but the frantic, erratic spasms of a pain so absolute it had become a physical force. It did not fight with strategy, but with the raw, unrefined fury of its birth trauma. Its first phase was a pathetic, heart-rending display of this fury. It would leap with a shocking, jerky agility, the great placenta swinging in its grasp not as a weapon, but as a counterweight to its own unbearable lightness of being. The blows it struck with the mass were clumsy, wide, and devastating, each impact sending up geysers of dark sand and that weeping, black fluid from the stones, the shockwaves vibrating up through a hunter's legs and into their teeth. And all the while it cried. Its wail was a physical thing, a sonic blade that carved through the air, a wave of despair that could stagger the mind as well as the body. To be caught in its cry was to be momentarily submerged in its consciousness, to feel the dizzying vertigo of a fall from the cosmos, the crushing pressure of the deep sea, and the searing, incomprehensible loss of the one presence that should have meant safety. Then came the transformation, the moment the nightmare truly bared its teeth. As the Orphan's health, a ludicrous concept for a being that was the embodiment of a curse, waned, its form would undergo a second, more terrifying birth. Its back would arch violently, the spine contorting with a series of wet, cracking reports that echoed like gunshots across the silent shore. From between its shoulder blades, two great membranous wings would erupt, not of feather or skin, but of solidified light and shadow, webbed with pulsing crimson veins. They were the wings of a celestial insect, of a thing never meant for this world, and their unfurling was accompanied by a burst of searing, white-hot energy that scorched the air and cast the hunter's own shadow, stark and accusing, against the crimson-lit sand. In this second phase, the pathetic homunculus was gone, replaced by a true scion of the Great Ones, a being of terrifying beauty and absolute, focused malice. Its movements became fluid, graceful, and impossibly fast. It was no longer a child swinging a grotesque toy. It was a god of vengeance, conducting a symphony of annihilation. The placenta became an extension of its will, whipping through the air to release arcs of that same burning energy, projectiles of condensed grief that sought to erase whatever they touched. It would take to the air, hanging for a moment against the vortex of the sky, a stark, black silhouette against the bloody light, before plummeting down like a meteor of pure hatred. The sand of the battleground itself became an active participant in this final, cosmic reckoning, where the Orphan's blood, a pale, luminescent fluid that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of sorrow, fell, the ground would not merely absorb it. Instead, the sand would writhe and bubble, giving birth to tiny, shrieking homunculi that were imperfect echoes of the Orphan itself. These minuscule, shambling things lived for only seconds, their entire existence a brief, shrieking parody of their progenitor's agony, before collapsing back into inert, dark stains. They were a reminder that the Orphan's pain was generative, that it could not help but create more of itself, perpetuating its suffering in an infinite, fractal regression. To fight the Orphan was to wade through this ever-renewing tide of its own self-replicating misery, each tiny death underfoot afresh, minor note in the overwhelming crescendo of its lament. The psychological toll of this confrontation was immeasurable. A hunter was not merely testing their skill and endurance against a powerful foe. They were actively immersing themselves in the epicenter of a curse that had shaped their entire vocation. Every dodge, every parry, every desperate swing of their own weapon was a reenactment of the original sin. They were playing the part of Jayaman, of the Byrgenwerth hunters, on the very stage where the atrocity was committed. The ghostly whispers from the mist grew louder here, no longer fragmented memories, but clear, desperate pleas. Why? A woman's voice would sob from just behind the hunter's shoulder. My child, a man's voice would groan from the swirling crimson air. These were not illusions. They were the final, coherent thoughts of the slain, pulled from the depths of time by the intensity of the recreated violence, using the hunter as a conduit to voice their eternal, unanswered questions. The hunter became a medium for the dead, their own mind a battleground for the ghosts of the past, even as their body fought for survival in the present. And when the final blow was struck, when the Orphan of Kos let out one last, shuddering cry that seemed to drain the color from the nightmare itself, the victory was hollow, a cup filled with ashes. The creature did not die with a roar of defiance, but with a whimper, a sigh of profound, exhausted relief. Its spectral form would dissolve, not into blood or viscera, but into a cloud of shimmering, pale motes of light that drifted upwards, like a swarm of fireflies returning to a starless sky. The massive placenta it clutched would fall to the sand with a final, wet thud. And then it, too, would dissipate, leaving behind only the memory of its weight and the lingering, foul scent of amniotic fluid and cosmic decay. The silence that returned was different from before. The oppressive, active misery was gone, replaced by a passive, weary emptiness. The crimson light faded from the sky, the vortex of clouds dispersing to reveal the familiar, jaundiced twilight of the hamlet. The wind began to blow again, its keening note now softer, carrying not fury, but a vast, immeasurable fatigue. The release of the orphan did not break the nightmare. How could it? The sin was historical, the wound eternal. Its death was merely the closing of a single, screaming mouth in a chorus of millions. The curse remained. The transformed villagers still patrolled their flooded lanes. The shock giants still circled the well, and the ghosts still whispered their litany of loss. But something had shifted. The hammering, central pain that gave the nightmare its relentless, driving energy was now absent. The hell remained, but its heart had been stilled. It would continue, a self-sustaining engine of punishment, but the raw, screaming nerve at its core had been granted a moment's peace. For the hunter, the act was one of euthanasia, of putting a suffering thing out of its misery. They had not conquered the past. They had merely offered a temporary balm to one of its most vivid and terrible manifestations. The weight of the sin was not lifted from their shoulders. If anything, by being the one to deliver that final, merciful blow, they had taken a portion of it upon themselves, becoming a new, living vessel for a fragment of the hamlet's endless sorrow. They had not escaped the cycle. They had simply changed their role within it, from interloper to participant, from hunter to penitent. Forever bound to the memory of the crying child on the shore and the mother who slept in the deep, waiting for a dawn that would never come. The silence after the orphan's dissolution was a presence in itself, a hollowed-out cathedral of sound where only the memory of a scream echoed. The hunter stood alone on the shore, their own breath a ragged, foreign noise in the newfound quiet. The air, once thick enough to chew, now felt thin, almost brittle, as if the release of that concentrated anguish had created a vacuum that the mundane misery of the hamlet was slowly, laboriously refilling. The crimson light was gone, but the jaundiced twilight that returned seemed paler, washed out, like an old bruise fading to a sickly yellow. The sand beneath their feet felt different, too, less resistant, as if the fight had ground down some of its sharp, accusatory edges. But it was a fleeting sensation. Already, the black, weeping fluid was beginning to seep anew from the stones, slower now, more like a deep, tired bleeding than the frantic tears of before. Looking out at the toxic, green sea, the hunter might have noticed a change in its rhythm. The waves, which had crashed with such weary aggression, now seemed to lap the shore with a kind of listless confusion, their directionless motion that of a body still twitching after the soul has departed. The phosphorescent swirls within the depths had dimmed, their frantic patterns replaced by a slower, more diffuse glow, like the last embers of a fire sinking into ash. Far out near the misty horizon where the sky and sea bled together, a shape seemed to form in the haze, not the shadow of a leviathan, but something vast and indistinct. A silhouette of a recumbent figure, perhaps, or simply a trick of the exhausted mind, projecting its grief onto the void. It was there for only a moment before the mist closed in again, swallowing the vision, but the impression lingered. The sense of a sleeping presence, wounded and dreaming, its rest forever troubled by the violation that had taken place on this shore. The journey back from that cursed beach was a walk through a world whose fundamental axis had shifted. The fishmen, the transformed villagers, still shambled and lurked, but their movements seemed less charged with that same razor-wire intensity. Their guttural bellows were more spaced out, their attacks lacking the fervent, hate-fueled precision of before. It was as if they were actors in a play whose director had just walked out, continuing their parts from muscle memory alone, the core passion of their performance extinguished. Their milky, abyssal eyes held a new emptiness, a deeper confusion. They were still monstrous, still deadly, but the divine rage that had animated them was gone, leaving behind only the base, animalistic residue of their curse. They were now truly the orphans, cut off from the source of their purpose, their eternal punishment continuing out of sheer, mindless momentum. Passing the well where the Rakuyo lay entombed, the hunter would feel a different quality in the silence there. The oppressive, self-loathing aura that had clung to the place had not vanished, but it had mellowed into a profound, settled melancholy. The shark giants still circled in the murky water below, but their patrol seemed more ritualistic, a habit engraved deep into their monstrous bones, rather than a vigilant guard duty. The black, reflective liquid at the bottom of the well was perfectly still. a disk of obsidian that no longer seemed to pull at the soul, but simply existed, a dark mirror showing nothing, accepting everything. It was a place of concluded sorrow, where a single act of penitence had been fully absorbed into the landscape, its drama spent. Climbing the steep, rocky path away from the hamlet, the hunter would pass the ghostly, flickering forms of the fisherfolk. These phantoms, too, were changed. Their silent screams had softened into sighs. Their frantic, repetitive motions of hauling nets or fleeing from unseen attackers had slowed to a weary, shuffling pace. They were no longer trapped in the sharp, painful moment of their death, but seemed to be drifting through the long, gray aftermath. One particularly vivid apparition, an old woman hunched over a ghostly cooking pot, did not look up in terror as the hunter passed, but simply stirred the empty air with a ladle, her translucent face etched with a sadness so deep, and so accepted it was more heartbreaking than any scream. They were becoming their own memorials, their sharp edges worn smooth by the endless, grinding passage of nightmare time. Reaching the base of the astral clock tower, the hunter would find the atmosphere there similarly transformed. The intricate, celestial machinery of the clock face, which had once seemed to tick with the relentless, judgmental rhythm of fate, was now still. The great gears and balances were frozen, the symbols of the cosmos etched into its surface, looking less like a map of higher knowledge and more like a forgotten language. The air in the cavernous chamber was cold and dry, tasting of metal and dust, the scent of a tomb that has been sealed for millennia. The climb up the long, winding staircase was a journey through a monument that had lost its meaning. The beautiful, stained glass windows that depicted the heavens now seemed like a lie, their vibrant colors dulled, their stories rendered irrelevant by the crude, bloody truth festering at the base of the tower. And at the top, in the chamber where Lady Maria had stood her eternal vigil, there was only an emptiness that ached. The chair where she sat was vacant. The scent of old blood and gentleness had dissipated, leaving behind the same sterile, tomb-like air as the rest of the tower. Her absence was a louder statement than her presence had ever been. It spoke of a sentence served, a duty finally relinquished. Perhaps, with the orphan's release, the secret she had been forced to guard had lost its potency, its terrible, corrosive power neutralized just enough to allow her spirit to fade. Or perhaps her torment was simply relocated, transferred to some deeper, more private corner of the nightmare. But her departure from this post left the clock tower as a hollow shell, a beautiful, intricate lock on a door that no longer needed to be kept. The hunter was free to pass through, to return to the more familiar, though no less damned, layers of the nightmare, but the victory felt like a loss. They had cleared a path, but the path led only to more cycles, more violence, more layers of the same foundational sin. For the sin of the Fishing Hamlet was not a single event that could be absolved or undone. It was a foundational crack in the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. The hunters of Byrgenwerth had approached the divine not with open hands, but with scalpels and specimen jars. They had sought to possess insight, to own it, to to distill it into a liquid they could inject into their veins. In doing so, they had proven themselves unworthy of the very knowledge they craved. The nightmare was the cosmos's answer. It was not a punishment born of malice, but a natural consequence, a spiritual law of cause and effect. Just as a body will wall off an infection with a cyst, the collective unconscious of the world had walled off this transgression, creating the hunter's nightmare to quarantine the guilt and the violence, to prevent it from poisoning all of reality. The hunter, now carrying the fresh memory of the orphan's final sigh, became a living part of this quarantine. The blood echoes they had gathered in this place hummed with a new, complex frequency within them. They were no longer just the residue of slain beasts. They were now infused with the specific, sorrowful resonance of the hamlet. This tainted insight would color their perceptions forever. In the waking world, the chime of a church bell might sound like a distorted echo of the astral clock tower. The smell of a damp cellar might bring back the cloying scent of the drowned village. The sight of a mother comforting her child could trigger a pang of grief so profound, and so alien it could only belong to the orphan. They had not just witnessed the story, they had ingested it. They had become an archive of the tragedy, a walking, breathing reliquary whose very cells now held the salt of that cursed shore and the silent, star-filled depth of a dead mother's gaze. This was the true, insidious nature of the curse. It was not merely a trap for the blood-drunk. It was a mimetic disease, an idea of sin and punishment that replicated itself through the act of hunting. Every time a hunter lost themselves to the thrill of the chase, they were unconsciously reenacting the original, acquisitive hunger of Byrgenwerth. And every time a hunter entered the nightmare and faced its truths, they took a piece of it with them when they left, spreading its psychic stain, however faintly, back into the waking world. The hunter who had faced the orphan was now a prime carrier. Their very presence would subtly warp the world around them, amplifying the latent violence and sorrow in others, drawing other potential sinners closer to the nightmare's event horizon. They were both the physician and the plague, the one who had administered a balm to a suffering god, and the one who now carried its contagion within their soul. As they moved away from the coast, the mournful cry of the gulls returned, but it was different now. It was not a sound of warning or mourning, but one of recognition. They were calling to one of their own, a creature now just as lost and adrift as they were, a soul forever tied to the salt-scrubbed stones and the weeping sky, a permanent citizen of this beautiful, terrible, and endless dream of death. The path leading away from the clock tower was no longer a mere corridor of stone, but a tunnel through congealed time. The air here was stale, tasting of powdered rock and the faint, metallic residue of spent miracles, a flavor like licking a long cold battery. The walls, which might once have been adorned with tapestries depicting celestial alignments or the noble lineage of the healing church, were now bare, their surfaces smooth and strangely soft to the touch, as if coated in a layer of accumulated psychic dust. The only illumination came from a source that was not a source at all, but a general, sauceless glow that seemed to emanate from the air molecules themselves. A tired, gray light that revealed nothing clearly, but merely confirmed the existence of the path ahead. Each footfall, even on the solid stone, produced a muffled, thudding sound that was absorbed almost instantly by the oppressive stillness. As if the nightmare, exhausted by its own central drama, could no longer be bothered to echo the passage of an intruder. This transitional space felt like the connective tissue between two diseased organs. The specific, salt-cured agony of the hamlet was behind, but the more generalized, institutional madness of the hunters' nightmares other domains lay ahead. The shift was felt in the bones before it was seen with the eyes. The pervasive dampness and the taste of salt began to recede, replaced by a different kind of moisture, a cold, creeping humidity that carried the scent of old paper, formaldehyde, and the faint, sweetish odor of visceral decay. This was the smell of Byrgenwerth's legacy, the aroma of scholarship turned to butchery. And it grew stronger with every step, a olfactory guide leading the hunter deeper into the consequences of that original, intellectual hunger. The very texture of the silence changed, too. The hamlet's silence had been a roaring, keening thing, filled with the ghost of the wind and the sea. This new silence was a library's silence, a muffled, absorbing quiet that spoke of secrets kept, of horrors documented, and then locked away in deep drawers, of things learned that should have been left unknown. Soon, the architecture began to mutate in sympathy with this new atmosphere. The smooth, almost organic stone of the clock tower's base gave way to more structured, angular masonry. But it was a structure succumbing to a different kind of ruin. The walls were lined with empty, recessed bookshelves, their wood warped and splintered, the ghosts of 1,000 stolen or burned texts lingering in the negative space they left behind. Iron sconces held the blackened, crystalline remains of what might once have been candles, their light long since extinguished, their forms now looking like frozen, carbonized screams. Doorways led not to rooms, but to shallow, dark alcoves where the shadows were thickest, and from which a sense of being watched was a constant, prickling sensation on the back of the neck. It was not the aggressive, hate-filled gaze of the fishmen, but a colder, more analytical observation, the feeling of being studied by something that had long since lost any concept of empathy or morality, something that saw a hunter not as a person, but as another fascinating, violent specimen to be catalogued. The ground beneath began to slope downwards, a gentle but persistent decline that felt like a descent into a buried memory. The air grew colder still, the humidity condensing into a fine, cold mist that beaded on the hunter's garb and equipment. The walls began to show patches of a strange, phosphorescent lichen, a fungus that pulsed with a slow, greenish light, its rhythm unnervingly similar to a resting heartbeat. This bioluminescence provided the only real light now, casting long, wavering shadows that danced and jittered with the hunter's own movement, making it seem as though a host of silent, stalking companions moved just at the edge of vision. The sound of dripping water became a constant, irregular percussion, each drop hitting a shallow puddle with a plink that was both tiny and immense in the all-consuming quiet. The acoustic signature of a place that was slowly, patiently, dissolving back into the earth. And then the hunter would see them, the first of the new inhabitants. Not the twisted fisherfolk, but the patients or the scholars. It was impossible to tell which. They were hunched, shambling figures draped in the tattered, grey remnants of what might have been academic robes or hospital gowns. Their postures were broken, spines curved into permanent question marks of pain or supplication. They moved with a slow, dragging gait, their feet whispering across the damp stone. They did not seem to notice the hunter, or if they did, they gave no sign. Their attention was turned inward, their heads bowed as if in deep, tormented study. Some of them clutched at their own heads, their fingers digging into their scalps, while others simply wandered in aimless, intersecting circles, their mouths moving soundlessly, forming words without air. They were the casualties of the pursuit of insight, their minds hollowed out by the very knowledge they had sought, leaving behind only the wreckage of their humanity, a walking testament to the fact that some truths are not meant for mortal brains to hold, and that the price for such forbidden sight is the very sanity that sought it. Their faces, when glimpsed in the fleeting, sickly light of the glowing fungus, were masks of vacant horror. Their eyes were wide, but saw nothing of the present. They were fixed on some internal, looping nightmare of their own, some memory of a surgical theater or a library where the books bled and the texts whispered madness. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over skulls that seemed too large, too complex, as if their brains had physically swelled with the influx of cosmic information before collapsing in on themselves. They were pitiable, these lost souls, but their pity was a dangerous thing. To feel too much of it was to risk being pulled into their stagnant, psychic despair, to feel one's own thoughts beginning to slow and congeal in sympathy. They were the background radiation of this place, the human fallout from an intellectual explosion that had occurred long ago. And their silent, shuffling presence was a more potent warning than any roaring beast could ever be. The corridor eventually opened into a larger chamber, a vast, cavernous space that felt less like a room and more like a geological formation that had been roughly hewn into a semblance of order. The ceiling was lost in a darkness so profound it seemed to be a solid thing, a roof of pure void. The green, pulsing lichen was more abundant here, clustering in thick, vein-like patterns across the walls and floor, illuminating the space in a series of interconnected, throbbing pools of light. The center of the chamber was dominated by a sight that was both bizarre and deeply unsettling. A wide, shallow pool of clear, still water. But this was not the toxic sea of the hamlet. This water was pristine, unnaturally so, and it was from this pool that the dripping sound originated. Dozens of the lost, shuffling figures stood motionless around its edges, staring down into its depths with their unblinking, vacant eyes. Approaching the pool, the hunter would see why. The water was a scrying medium, but it did not show the future. It showed the past, and it showed the self. Peering into its glassy surface, one would not see their own reflection, but a shifting, phantasmagoric montage of memories. But they were not the hunter's memories. They were the memories of the scholars, of the patients, of the hunters who had come before and been consumed. The water showed flashes of the lecture halls of Byrgenwerth, of Provost Willem pointing a trembling finger at a star chart, his eyes burning with a desperate fire. It showed the dark, wet confines of the labyrinth tombs, the first glimpse of a kin, its form a beautiful, mind-shattering blasphemy. It showed the gleam of a scalpel in a lamplit room, the frantic, eager hands of a scholar dissecting something that still twitched with a life not of this earth. And it showed the hunter, too. It showed them in moments of violence, of blood-drunken euphoria, their face contorted in a rictus of joy and fury, their weapon rising and falling in a rhythm of slaughter. It was a mirror that reflected not the face, but the soul's resume of sin, both personal and inherited. The figures around the pool were not watching for entertainment. They were trapped in a recursive, penitent observation of their own damnation. They were forced to watch the moment their curiosity turned to obsession, the moment their pursuit of knowledge crossed the line into atrocity, over and over again, each viewing etching the memory deeper into their hollowed-out consciousness. The pool was a liquid conscience for those who had none left, a relentless, unforgiving reminder of the path that had led them here. To look into it for too long was to risk the same fate, to feel one's own past actions, one's own complicity in the hunt's endless cycle, rising up to accuse them with a silent, watery voice. The only sound here, beyond the dripping, was an occasional, soft sob that would escape one of the watchers. A tiny, broken sound that was somehow more devastating than the orphan's cosmic wail. For it was a purely human sound of a regret that had been refined into its most concentrated, helpless form. Moving past the chamber of the scrying pool, the hunter would find the architecture becoming more clinical, more invasive. The stone was replaced in sections by glazed white tile, now cracked and stained with patches of brown and a lurid chemical yellow. The air took on a sharper, more astringent smell, the odor of antiseptics that had long since failed in their duty, now mingling with the pervasive scent of decay. The corridors narrowed into hallways lined with heavy, iron-bound doors, each fitted with a small, barred window at eye level. Behind these doors, faint, scrabbling sounds could sometimes be heard, or a low, wet, gurgling breathing. These were the private cells, the places where the most promising or the most corrupted subjects had been taken for deeper study. The horror here was not one of open violence, but of restrained, systematic violation. It was the horror of the hypothesis tested beyond all reason, of the living body treated as a mere site for experimentation, where the line between patient and specimen had been irrevocably erased. This was the research hall, the living, breathing embodiment of the sin of Byrgenwerth, distilled to its most cruel and practical application. If the hamlet was the site of the original transgression, this was where the spoils of that transgression were processed, where the stolen knowledge of the cosmos was forced into human vessels to see what would break first, the vessel or the laws of nature themselves. The hunter, carrying the salt of the sea and the echo of the orphan's cry, was now walking into the laboratory where the consequences of that cry were meticulously, heartlessly, and endlessly documented. The transition was not a crossing of a threshold, but a slow, osmotic absorption into a new quality of suffering. The air in the research hall was a palpable entity, a thick, chemical broth that coated the tongue with a flavor of bitter almonds and spoiled milk, a testament to alchemical processes that had curdled into a kind of permanent, toxic rot. It was colder here than in the connective tunnels, a dry, sterile cold that seeped into the joints and made the bones ache with a dull, persistent throb. The kind of cold found in mortuaries and storage rooms for biological specimens. The light, too, had changed. The sauceless gray glow was gone, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving glare of lumenwood lamps, their bases bolted to the ceiling at regular intervals. These lamps gave off a stark white light that bleached all color from the surroundings, casting sharp, black shadows that hid nothing, but instead seemed to accentuate every crack in the tile, every dark stain on the floor, every horrifying detail of the place. It was an illumination without warmth, without mercy, a light designed for observation, not for comfort, and it made the hunter feel like a specimen pinned to a board, their every movement noted by some unseen, dispassionate eye. The hallway stretched before them, an endless-seeming vista of identical doors and glazed tile, the perspective warped by the sheer, monotonous repetition. The only break in the symmetry were the occasional metal gurneys pushed against the walls, their surfaces stained with rust and other, less identifiable substances, their wheels locked in place by a buildup of grime and neglect. Upon some of these gurneys lay shapes, shrouded in stained canvas, the outlines beneath suggesting forms that were unsettlingly human, yet distorted, with too many limbs or limbs in the wrong places, or a general sense of bloated, fluid-filled expansion. A low, constant hum vibrated through the floor, a sound generated by some vast, hidden machinery, a droning note that seemed to resonate at the same frequency as a migraine, pressing against the temples from the inside. It was the sound of the hall itself, a living, breathing engine of torment, its gears and pumps and alchemical stills still functioning with a mindless, terrible efficiency long after the minds that had built it had succumbed to the very madness they sought to cultivate. The first of the inhabitants here were not the shuffling, lost scholars, but the attendants. They moved with a jerky, marionette-like purpose, their bodies swathed in heavy leather aprons that were cracked and stiff with old blood and chemical spills. Their faces were hidden behind featureless metal masks, their eyeholes dark and empty, giving no hint of the consciousness, if any, that lay behind them. They carried trays laden with instruments that were neither wholly surgical nor wholly tools of torture, but a grotesque hybrid of the two. bone saws with serrated edges that gleamed with a cruel sharpness, long, thin needles connected to glass reservoirs of cloudy fluids, and strange, claw-like devices whose purpose was best left unimagined. They did not acknowledge the hunter, their attention fixed on their tasks, moving from one heavy door to another, unlocking them with large iron keys that jangled on a ring at their belts, disappearing inside for moments that stretched into eternities before emerging again, sometimes with a fresh stain on their apron, to continue their silent, horrifying rounds. Their movements were precise, economical, and utterly devoid of empathy. The movements of gardeners tending to a crop of pain, pruning and feeding, and observing the growth of the horrors they cultivated behind those locked doors. From behind the doors came the sounds. This was not the roaring of beasts or the whispered lamentations of ghosts, but a more intimate, more psychologically corrosive symphony of suffering. There were soft, wet, tearing sounds, followed by a weak, gurgling moan. There was the frantic, skittering scratch of nails on tile, a desperate, animal attempt to escape. There was a low, monotonous weeping that went on and on, a sound of such profound, broken hopelessness that it seemed to sap the very will from the air around it. And sometimes there were voices, but they were not forming words. They were simply making sounds, experimenting with their own corrupted vocal cords, producing chirps, clicks, and high-pitched, ululating wails that were utterly alien, the language of a humanity that had been unmade and reassembled into something new and pitiable. These sounds layered over the droning hum of the machinery, creating a cacophony that was somehow worse than any outright scream. For it spoke of a suffering that was ongoing, managed, and institutionalized. One of the doors stood slightly ajar, the lock broken or perhaps left open by an attendant in its mindless routine. Pushing it open revealed a small, square room, its walls and floor made of the same glazed white tile, now clouded with a patina of grime. In the center of the room was a chair, a heavy, wooden thing fitted with leather restraints that were dark and supple with use. The room was empty of an occupant, but it was far from empty of presence. The air was thick with the smell of fierce wet and a coppery tang, and on the floor, a dark, viscous puddle had spread from a drain set in the center of the tiles. Scattered around the chair were a few strands of hair, some long and dark, others pale and fine, and a single discarded tooth that looked too small to be an adult's. A small metal table stood against one wall, its surface holding a tray upon which a single, long syringe lay, its needle gleaming. A single, perfect drop of a clear, iridescent fluid trembling at its tip, refusing to fall. This room was a stage for a single, recurring act of violation, and the silence within it was louder and more accusatory than all the moans and whimpers from the other cells combined. It was a template of pain, a pristine white hell waiting for its next participant. Further down the hall, the architecture opened up into a larger, circular chamber, a central hub from which several other corridors branched off like the spokes of a wheel. This space was dominated by a terrifying sight, a massive, complex apparatus of glass, copper, and iron that rose from the floor to the shadowed ceiling. It was a distillation engine, a thing of twisted, beautiful logic, its purpose clearly to refine and process the phantasmal fluids and arcane essences harvested from the kin and the unfortunate test subjects. Dozens of glass bulbs and reflux condensers were interconnected by a labyrinth of copper tubing, within which fluids of unearthly colors, a luminous blue, a sickly green, a deep Venus purple, bubbled and circulated. The air around it shimmered with heat and a palpable psychic resonance, a buzzing static that made the fillings in a hunter's teeth ache. This was the heart of the hall, the engine of their ambition. It was here that the holy medium was purified, that the echoes of the cosmos were distilled into a form that could be injected, ingested, or otherwise forced upon a human frame. The hum was loudest here, a deep, resonant thrumming that was felt in the chest cavity, the sound of a god's blood being processed on an industrial scale. And around the base of this monstrous engine, the results of its work were on full, horrifying display. The subjects here were not confined to cells. They were integrated. Some were partially fused with the machinery itself, their torsos emerging from a tangle of pipes and wires, their limbs replaced with crude mechanical prostheses that twitched and spasmed independently. Others were bound to gurneys that were themselves connected to the apparatus by thick rubber hoses, through which the colored fluids pulsed rhythmically, feeding them a continuous, toxic drip of insight. Their bodies were landscapes of mutation. One woman had a second, vestigial head growing from her shoulder, its eyes wide and staring, its mouth opening and closing in perfect, silent synchrony with her own silent screams. A man nearby had skin that had taken on the translucent, veined quality of the lumenwood mushrooms, patches of his flesh glowing with a soft, internal light, illuminating the frantic, trapped terror in his eyes. Their humanity was not being erased. It was being overwritten, painted over with the brushstrokes of a cosmic artist who had no concern for the canvas. They were living palimpsests, their original selves still visible beneath the layers of horrific, imposed change, and the contradiction was a torture in itself. The attendants moved among them, not as healers, but as mechanics, adjusting valves, tapping gauges, and occasionally using a long metal prod to elicit a response from a subject who had grown too still. There was no malice in their actions, only a chilling, procedural detachment. They were maintaining the experiment, ensuring the data stream continued, their blank metal masks reflecting the distorted, suffering faces of their charges without a flicker of recognition. To witness this scene was to understand the true depth of the sin. It was not merely the violence of the hamlet, a hot, passionate crime of acquisition. This was a cold sin, a sin of intellect divorced from soul, of curiosity calcified into a relentless, dehumanizing process. It was the sin of seeing life not as a mystery to be revered, but as a problem to be solved, a substance to be manipulated, regardless of the cost to the vessel. The hunter, standing there with the memory of the sea's raw, emotional wrath fresh in their mind, now faced its opposite. A calculated, systematic, and infinitely more patient kind of evil. One of the branching corridors led to a room that was different from the others. It was not a cell, but a library, or what remained of one. The air here was thick with the smell of moldering paper and the dry, sweet scent of ancient leather bindings. Books were piled in teetering stacks on the floor, their pages spilling out, covered in dense, spidery script and intricate, mind-bending diagrams that seemed to shift and writhe if stared at for too long. In the center of the room, seated at a large mahogany desk, was a figure. It was one of the scholars, but unlike the shuffling, vacant-eyed wrecks near the scrying pool, this one was alert, its movements sharp and bird-like. Its head was enormous, its skull distended to an almost spherical shape, and it was entirely hairless. Its eyes were wide, the pupils dilated so fully they were like pools of ink, and they darted back and forth across the pages of an open folio with a frantic, hungry intensity. It muttered to itself in a low, rapid stream of consciousness, a jumble of mathematical formulae, anatomical terms, and phrases in dead languages, all punctuated by soft, mad giggles. This was a scholar who had not been broken by the insight, but consumed by it, their mind having expanded to accommodate the cosmic truths only to find there was no room left for anything else, not even the basic architecture of sanity. It was a living engine of pure, unfiltered knowledge, burning itself out in a brilliant, self-destructive fever dream. And its presence was a terrifying glimpse into the desired end state of Byrgenwerth's ambition, a fate arguably worse than the physical torments inflicted in the cells nearby. The hunter's passage through the research hall was a descent through the layers of this intellectual damnation. Each corridor, each chamber, revealed a new facet of the atrocity. They saw rooms where subjects were suspended in tanks of a clear, gelatinous fluid, their bodies floating weightless, their features blurred and distorted by the medium, bubbles occasionally escaping their lips to drift slowly to the surface. They passed an operating theater, its tiers of observation seats empty, the central table stained a deep, dark brown. The tools laid out upon a nearby stand with a neat, fastidious precision that was more horrifying than any chaotic bloodbath. They saw a small, windowless room where the walls were covered in frantic, desperate scratches. Not words, but spirals and angles and complex geometric patterns. The final, futile attempts of a dissolving mind to map the unmapeable truths that were devouring it from the inside out. This was the legacy of the Fishing Hamlet, processed and refined. The raw, weeping wound of the coast had been brought here to this sterile, white-tiled hell and dissected. The grief of the orphan had been analyzed. The blood of Kos had been catalogued. The transformative power of the great ones had been broken down into its constituent parts and injected into human beings to see what would happen. And what happened was this: a gallery of living failures, a museum of magnificent, terrible mistakes, a monument not to what humanity could become, but to what it was willing to sacrifice of itself in the desperate, foolish, and ultimately damned attempt to reach for a heaven it could not comprehend. The hunter, carrying the salt and the sorrow of the Shah, was now a witness to the factory where that sorrow was industrialized, and the weight of it all, the personal guilt, the inherited sin, the sheer, staggering scale of the suffering, pressed down upon them with a force that felt like the weight of the ocean itself. A crushing, silent pressure that promised no surface, no air, and no end.